Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. This week we're reflecting on John chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. This is another one of my favorite passages, by the way, because it's so often misunderstood, and I think when we get it right, it's really liberating. There is this incredible song by Bruce Springsteen on his famous Nebraska record called Mansion on a Hill. And it's interesting on its own because it's, as he often does, the boss telling a story, imagining when he and his sister were young and his dad would drive them around in the countryside and they would see this big mansion on the hill. And he talks about going into the cornfields and looking in the windows and seeing this wealthy person living this like untouchable, unimaginable life for this little poor kid from rural New Jersey. And in its way, especially being on the Nebraska album, it's a critique of wealth. It's a critique of class differences and all these kinds of things. It's really fascinating. What's even more fascinating, though, is that it is responding to the idea of a mansion on a hill, which was wildly popular in gospel music and in country music. Hank Williams had a version of this song, and there was a gospel song called Mansion Over the Hilltop that was popularized by the likes of Elvis Presley and the Gaithers. And in fact, I'm going to put YouTube links to these songs in the description below. So if you want to go and listen to these songs and hear how different they are, you can pause this video and go do that, or you can do it after the video, whatever you want to do. But I think you should. It's really interesting to hear these songs next to each other because Bruce is in conversation with this idea that so many Christians, when we die, we think we're going to get a mansion with all of these riches. And that's what the hymn's about. It's about how I might be poor here on earth, but when I die, I'm going to get this amazing mansion and have all of this wealth so that essentially I can suffer for now in the unjust systems that Springsteen's song critiques, because later things are going to be so much better for me. I'm going to get to be the wealthy one on the other side. And again, all of that comes from this particular interpretation of John chapter 14. That was popularized, I think, in my generation by Audio Adrenaline and their song Big House, right? The idea that there's this big house with lots and lots of rooms in it. That all comes from this reading of John chapter 14, where Jesus says, "Do you not know that in my Father's house there are many rooms?" There's in the old King James, that was translated many mansions. And I'll go to prepare a place there for you. What I think is so interesting is that so often in our faith, we imagine a faith that looks an awful lot like what Springsteen is critiquing. There's a select chosen group that's inside where it's warm and wealthy and safe, and then everyone else is on the outside looking in. And yet what John 14 is really about is this radical faith that's broken open, that doesn't have any walls, that welcomes everybody. And you're asking, where is that in there? I read it before I watched the Beacon Bit, and I'm just not seeing that. Well, let me show you, because it involves attending to how John uses certain symbols and language throughout the course of his gospel. So in the first place, Jesus says, "In my Father's house." Now, any Jewish person would know that when a Jew says God's house, they're talking about specifically the temple. And that shouldn't be that weird to us. I remember as a kid, I got in trouble like 1,000 million times for running in God's house. And what that meant was I was playing in the church with my friends, right? I was running in church, and we called the church God's house. So it shouldn't be that big of a leap to see, well, the Jews do that too, right? They call the temple God's house. You see it all through the Psalms. It was a very common thing. So when Jesus said to his followers, "In my Father's house," they immediately knew he's talking about the temple. Now then he says, though, "In my Father's house there are many rooms, and I go to prepare one for you." Now that's weirder because the temple really only had like 3 rooms. It had the front area where the priests went, it had the holy area, and then it had the holiest area. So that's not many, right? And it's certainly not for them. None of them were priests. I'm not a priest. You're not a priest. The temple wasn't for everybody, actually. It was for a very small select group of people. Not even most Jews were allowed in the temple. And then Jesus talks about going to prepare a place. Well, we know in John's Gospels that anytime Jesus is talking about preparing or going or advancing, he's always pointing to his own crucifixion. And that shines some light on this temple language too, because throughout John's Gospel, anytime Jesus talks about the temple, he's only talking about his own body. You see that most clearly in the temple cleansing, clear back in John chapter 2, because he says, if you tear this temple down, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And then John, the editor, pops in and says, hey, by the way, when he was talking about the temple, he was talking about the temple of his body. So again, John's trying to make sure we connect all the dots here. When Jesus is talking about having room in his Father's house, he's talking about the temple, which is really his own body. And so what he's really saying is that in my body, there's room for everybody. And I'm about to go and make that so. I'm about to go get that ready for you. And he's talking about getting ready to go and get crucified. So if we kind of zoom out a little bit and see what Jesus is doing here in this really dense, poetic way, he's saying that when I'm crucified, my body is going to be broken open. And in the breaking open of my body, there's going to be room for everyone to come in. Which I think is actually a beautiful metaphor for what we see happening in the Gospels. Jesus is tearing down the walls that separate us from them. He's breaking down, as Paul says in Ephesians, the dividing wall between the Jews and the Gentiles. He's making it so that everyone has a place in God's house. Jesus's good news is not just good news for the Gaithers, it's good news for that little Bruce Springsteen and his sister watching from the fields, wishing so desperately that they could be a part of the party. Jesus blows out the walls like a holy Kool-Aid man and says that there's room for everyone, because that's what he wants and that's what he intends and that's what his work on the cross has accomplished. I look forward to talking about the implications for this in our Beacon bit today. Until then, grace and peace go with you.